Now another handy feature of lens blur is its ability to use a depth map to determine what sections of the image to blur. Let's open up another project of a scene that was rendered from a 3D program, and I also rendered a separate depth map that shows the distance of various objects from the camera. White is closer, black is further away. I'll select the image itself, not the depth map, and apply Effect Lens Blur. I'll crank up the blur a little bit so you can see what's going on to about 20 pixels. And for my depth map, I will select my special render from my 3D program. This will now cause some objects to appear sharply in focus, in this case the background, and other objects to appear out of focus. In other words, that grayscale depth map determines what is in or out of focus. I can invert the depth map, so instead close objects are in focus and far away objects are out of focus. I can also play around with the blur focal distance. What this parameter does is determine what values of gray are in focus, and then values on either side will go out of focus. For example, if I set this to 120, you'll see that these buildings in the back are in focus, while things in the foreground or things in the very back are out of focus. If I go ahead and move the focus a bit closer, 180, you'll see that the focus moves so that these objects are now in focus, the closest ones are slightly out of focus, and objects behind are also out of focus. So again, this allows you to add real-world camera effects to 3D renders where normally everything would be in perfect focus. Let's go ahead and look at another project. This is another case of a bit more fanciful of a 3D render. Again, I have objects that are rendered in 3D, and I've rendered a separate depth map that shows what's close, such as the leading edges of these screens, and what's far away. The darker the pixel, the further away it is. I've already got lens blur applied. I'll enable it. And I'll go ahead and calculate a RAM preview to show you what it's like to animate the blur focal distance over the length of this composition. In essence, I'll be pulling focus from near objects to far objects. Now, lens blur takes a while to render, so I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead to after this render's done. And here's a RAM preview of animating the blur focal distance, so objects close are initially in focus, and then moves to objects far away being in focus. Another useful application of the lens blur effect. Now, you might not always have a separate depth map for your scene. It is possible to create a depth map using lens blur. I'm going to go back to our first project where we had this night sky scene, and you notice that the whole scene is blurry, the blue sections as well as the stars. This is with lens blur turned off. Well, you can go ahead and pick a layer to be its own depth map. And what you want to do is pick whatever is going to be the best channel to work for depth. So I have my effect turned off, I'm going to go to my comp panel, and I want to find what color channel provides the greatest contrast between objects that are supposed to be out of focus, the stars, and objects that are supposed to be in focus, such as this blue haze. I'll go ahead and look at the red channel. That shows me a lot of contrast. The sky drops out to black while the stars are white. And we'll look at other channels for contrast. The green, fair. Blue, almost no contrast at all. That wouldn't be useful at all. The red channel is going to be my best map. I'll go back to RGB, turn on lens blur, choose for my depth map channel the red channel, and crank up my iris radius a little bit on my stars. You'll now see that the blue haze has remained in focus, but the stars have gone out of focus. And I can go ahead and play around with things such as the specular threshold to pump up the stars in the final render. Lens blur off, lens blur on. And it does take a moment to render. Now, these show some more realistic applications of the lens blur effect. You can also use it for interesting graphical looks. Go watch the movie on compound blur. You can do all those same things with lens blur, except for lens blur is going to look better. And that's a quick overview of lens blur. It's a very versatile effect, and it's particularly useful for visual effects work if you're trying to make scenes look a bit more realistic, particularly ones rendered in 3D. It does take some time to render, and it does take some time to tweak in and master, but if you're trying to get perfection, it's a good tool to use. If nothing else, it's a much better version of a compound blur effect, so rather than using compound blur, you might look at lens blur every now and then just to get a little smoother image.